Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is about fresh tensions between the Chinese People's Liberation Army and the Indian Army in eastern Ladakh. Reports emanating from India say that PLA troops crossed across what India claims to be its side of the line of actual control, south of Pangong Tso, and occupied a mountain top. The alleged ingress happened on Sunday, and according to these reports, PLA troops have begun building defenses on the captured hilltop. A report in the Indian newspaper Business Standard says, and I quote, "The PLA now occupies Helmet Top as well as a nearby feature called Black Top, both of which are on the Indian side of the LAC. From here, Chinese soldiers can observe and track Indian movements across the Pangong Lake and as far away as India's tactically vital Chushul garrison," unquote. The report further states that the PLA Western Theatre Command, which is responsible for the entire Sino-Indian border, accused India of illegally crossing the line on 31st August at 2 points, the south bank of Pangong Lake and near Rezangla. The statement said India had blatantly provoked and caused tension on the border and had undermined the consensus reached at the diplomatic and military talks. Interestingly, both sides have denied sustaining any casualties. There are no reports either of shots being fired. That said, it is clear that the LAC remains hot and tense, and any further incidents, while not inevitable, cannot be ruled out. India lost 20 soldiers, including the commanding officer of the unit, in an all-night physical scuffle with PLA troops on the night of 15th June, further north in the Galwan sector. Since before then, but especially after that clash, the two sides have been engaged in a two-track dialogue at the military and diplomatic levels to resolve the crisis. It doesn't appear that they are succeeding. To discuss this further, we are joined by Dr. Claude Rakisits. Dr. Rakisits has had almost 20 years of experience in the Australian public sector, including in the Departments of Defence, Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Mr. Rajiv Desai, an analyst who writes about change, politics, and cities. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Desai here. Mr. Desai, one of the really interesting and let me say also bizarre part of these episodes is that while some people in the Indian media talk about these ingresses, the political government has constantly tried to say, well, there has been no ingress on the Indian side of the line of actual control. Now, how does one square these positions?
With great difficulty, I'm afraid. Here's the point. There is absolutely no political leadership on this issue. So I dare say that there are not many in the political leadership who even know what this is all about, or the line of actual control, or the history, or the geography, or the sociology and psychology of the whole Indo-Chinese equation. So they have essentially they only want to win elections, and they only want to sort of trash the opposition. So they have no time for anything. This is all being run by bureaucrats. And, there was a time when India's bureaucracy, diplomatic bureaucracy and diplomats were actually the pride of the nation. And like everything else, that also has steadily declined. So therefore, you have a big mess. And the Chinese know it, and they can pretty much do whatever they want.
But Mr. Desai, I mean, people like Dr. Jayashankar, who was a former very senior diplomat, was foreign secretary, is now the foreign minister of India, is demonstrably a very able diplomat, and clearly he must be giving his input. Ditto for the Indian military. I mean, the Indian military has prided itself, not undeservedly, for having very professional general officer cadre. So it still doesn't make any sense to me. And when you talk about they're not being able to figure out the culture, the history, the sociology of the line of actual control, it's all, I mean, there are a number of books written by Indians, non-Indians, that clearly give the history, the culture, the geopolitics associated with the line of actual control.
We have a structure. This government, some time back, actually appointed the equivalent of what the United States they call the Joint Chief of Staff, and so there is a guy like that. If you've seen him talk, and then you know actually what I'm talking about. So, it's pretty much the same thing with Mr. Jaishankar, who came out of the bureaucracy. And so these guys are all dipped in what we like to call saffron, which is the prevalent belligerent ideology of the ruling party. And so one of the key requirements to be part of this is to have suspend your disbelief and then go and do whatever you think is right. And basically they all think that these wars and battles are only fought in the media, and it's what you say to the media that counts and not actually the reality. So they couldn't care less who's on which peak and who's across which line. They just want to make sure that on the evening news or in the morning's headlines, they're shown as resolute and so forth.
So let me summarize, Woteng, and correct me if I have got it wrong. You're saying that professional people like Dr. Jaishankar, the current Chief of Defense Staff, who's the former Indian Army Chief, General Bipin Rawat, they have basically cast aside their professionalism and are now mouthing their political masters. Have I got that right?
I don't know whether they're mouthing their political masters, because the political masters don't know what to mouth on these kinds of issues. So they're pretty much doing whatever they want, and as long as it shows up well in the evening news and in the morning's headlines, nobody cares.
Right. Stay with me, Mr. Desai. I have a few more questions also, but let me pull in Dr. Rakisits here. Dr. Rakisits, before I put my own question, I want to know what you think of what Mr. Desai is saying.
Well, I probably agree with what Mr. Desai has to say. I mean, in many ways, the bottom line is this. Prime Minister Modi has got to look good on the evening news or in the morning news or whatever it is. And the public servants, as well as the military, who are basically public servants in uniform, also want to make sure he looks good as well. So he does have a very good point there. How far they're going to go, I'm not sure. How much have they put away their professionalism? The fact is, President Modi pays them their salary, and so they will listen to that.
Now, this raises some troubling questions, as you would have noticed yourself. One of the things that, and there's been a long history of this, of the Indian military staying away from politics and giving its professional assessments to whichever civilian government at the time was in place. And there are lots of episodes that one can cite. So it seems that over the last 6 or 7 years, there has been a sort of erosion of that ethic, that professional ethics. And the top brass is now trying to get closer to the political, the principles, the civilian principles, and basically helping them or shouldering their agenda or whatever they say, which, if correct, and actually there are lots of instances that one can cite, if that is correct, then there is a major problem here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't know sufficiently about the ins and outs of how the thinking is going at headquarters with the Indian military. But it would also make sense for them to be agreeing with the political leadership, given that India has been caught completely flat-footed in this whole issue with the Chinese pretty much since April, May. So they might as well go with the political leaders to pretty much cover up their incompetence militarily.
Now, what you say is actually pretty much a throwback to the run-up to the 1962 war. There was, a political leadership. Jawaharlal Nehru did not really want to engage the Chinese in deciding the borders. He was actually looking at borders. In this particular case, the Ladakh-Johnson line, which even the Raj thought was too west of where it should have been. B.S. Bajpai was a very senior diplomat, and then the governor of then Bombay, now Mumbai, actually wrote to Mr. Nehru and said, well, you need to engage the Chinese. And Mr. Nehru contacted then Indian ambassador to Peking, Mr. Panikkar. And Mr. Panikkar wrote back to Mr. Bajpai saying, well, we don't need to do that. And Mr. Bajpai did not agree with that. And then, of course, we also know the mess there was at the top leadership of the Indian Army in the run-up to 1962. So what you're saying is basically like a throwback to those times.
I think very much so, and I think and loads of actually very good writing about this, is that they have been caught out on this one for the same sort of reasons. Is that back in '62, the Indian leadership never would have thought that another third world country would attack one of their own. It just wasn't, it was a non-aligned movement. This was simply not going to happen. And the same thing on the Modi. This whole Wuhan consensus, we can work together, we can do things together. Okay, we have a few issues, but I'm sure we can iron these things out. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, we have this. You remember, Prime Minister Modi wanted to be friendly, have all these informal meetings. He had two of them with President Xi. And he thought that was the way to go. And it's the same deal again. It's make believe. It's wishful thinking. And then facts on the ground clearly are not exactly the same as what the wishful thinking in the heads of the political leadership in Delhi.
Yeah, but there's the bit about the August 5th, 2019 decision with reference to Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. And the Chinese foreign ministry had reacted to it within 24 hours of that, raising the issue of, and then of course, the Exaichen thing, and then Mr. Amit Shah's statement that we will get Exaichen back from China. And so I think there are, those red rags to the bull. But let me pull in Mr. Desai here. Mr. Desai, in a broader sense, one of the things that Prime Minister Modi has tried to do, his development agenda hasn't gone anywhere, but the other thing that he sold to the people of India was a foreign policy that was smart and muscular. Now, it seems to me that is proving to be a house of cards. Would you comment on that, sir?
Yes, first I'd just like to very quickly dwell on the difference between 62 and now.
Okay.
Mr. Nehru, who was then the prime minister, was actually a thinker. He was well read, and yes, there might have been some wishful thinking in there. Also, it was just 13 or 15 years into independence. I don't think the Indian Army was that well equipped or anything of that sort. And of course, there was this wishful thinking, but that wishful thinking was based on a worldview and understanding, a fairly sophisticated understanding of the world. This is not so today at all. India has weapons and this and that, all the bells and whistles you need in the military. But I think what they don't have is somebody who can think. So this whole issue has very, very little comparison with 62. These guys have not only been caught flat-footed, but they don't care as long as it shows well on the news. And that's all they care. Now look at the diversions. They've got some actor is involved in some stories that are playing out on the media. This completely random stuff. Mr. Modi is in his monthly address is talking about toys for kids. It's just incredible. I mean, it's like unpreparedness, ineptitude, incompetence taken to a degree that I don't think Beavis and Butthead would understand.
but tell me, Mr. Desai, I love that reference. But tell me, what exactly is, at the end of the day, you have to deliver. Now, Mr. Modi got the first 5 years in which he could not deliver on his development agenda. He could not deliver on the economic revival, and from being the fastest growing country to now a country where some of the sectors are in negative growth. But then he got re-elected with a bigger headcount. Now, it seems to me that it would make eminent sense for him to avail that opportunity and to try and deliver instead of playing the Hindutva card, instead of, almost a certain kind of party sponsorship of majoritarianism that obviously is opposed to and in contravention of the secular pluralist constitution of India. What exactly is happening here? I mean, is it like someone who thinks that he is, while democratically elected, is essentially a dictator?
I think these are very high fundamental concepts that I don't think that any of these guys who are in power now can qualify for. The fact is that the Chinese have waltzed across the border, occupied huge chunks of their territory, and these guys don't seem to care. Now, Mr. Modi, apart from doing this business about toys and all in his monthly radio address, he's also been putting out videos of him feeding peacocks in his lawn and him doing yoga. What is this? I mean, he's there to show people, look where I've got. Look at me. Look where I've got. Look at the wonderful things I have. So that's the level at which this whole thing is operating. We even have an IT minister who, after the Facebook revelations where they were helping the BJP and so forth, the IT minister goes after Facebook and says, you're posting nasty things about Mr. Modi on Facebook. So, they don't even know that there are some rules and regulations that employees of large multinational corporations have to follow. So, yeah, it's we're just going to wait this one out. I mean, there's no other way to do this.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Rajiv Desai, speaking with us. Let me go to Dr. Rakisits here. Dr. Rakisits, this, frankly, to me, given the kind of face that is presented on the evening shows and the reality, this seems like the picture of Dorian Gray in the cellar, and it's not a very happy picture.
No, you're right, exactly. So what's exactly your question there? I agree with you, but
I mean, the question exactly is that this is a scenario in which the soft power capital that India had accumulated is fast eroding, and perhaps the world needs to take note of this. I mean, Mr. Desai is an Indian citizen. His long association, has been commenting on politics. And the other guests that I get from India, and more or less there is a refrain which says that Mr. Modi doesn't really know what he's doing. And on top of that, there is the Hindutva card that he plays.
No, I agree with you. I mean, there is again, a lot of wishful thinking or denial or looking in the other direction by countries, other than, like whether it's United States or Australia or whatever, that don't really want to see what is actually happening in India and the way Prime Minister Modi is governing India, and particularly its behavior and his policies. policies towards Kashmir specifically, and in general towards the Muslims in India. They simply do not want to see this. And I think we discussed this in one of our previous conversations on your program, in that it doesn't fit the narrative, in that the narrative is India is it's the largest democracy in the world. Yes, sure, but it has significant flaws to it. And because it's the largest democracy and it's part of the Quad, this quadrilateral security, coalition, the dialogue, we, the West, especially the members of the Quad, the United States, Japan, Australia, don't want to, sort of disturb India about issues like its behavior towards Kashmir and the Muslim minority in India. And so it's the same thing with what's happening now in India, in Ladakh. There's very little talk about it. Now, there are various reasons for this. CNN is not crawling all over it. A lot of people probably don't even know where Ladakh is. They don't even know what it's all about. But definitely, there is the reality of what's happening on the ground and what Prime Minister Modi is doing internally. And there's also the reality. And they don't gel very well, and that's why a lot of people don't want to talk about it too much, certainly in the Western countries.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was Dr. Claude Rakisits speaking with us. We are now joined by Professor Victor Gao, Director of the China National Association of International Studies and an Executive Director of Beijing Private Equity. Professor Gao, thank you for being on the program. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. We're talking about this latest tension along the line of actual control. I just had Mr. Rajiv Desai from India on the panel, and he was saying that the Indian government has absolutely no idea where this is going. Now, the Indian media is saying that the PLA troops have crossed over to the Indian side of the line of actual control. Give us a sense of what exactly is happening here.
Well, first of all, I think tensions remain high along the line of actual control between China and India. And apparently, the Chinese government and the Indian government are saying very different and conflicting things. So I think it will take some time before we really know what's happening along the line of actual control. And this time, the tension rises up in the Bangong Lake. And hopefully, the two governments will continue to do diplomacy rather than flaring up their tempers and resort to arms, because otherwise, both China and India will suffer grave consequences. And I think this is exactly the time for peace rather than for war between China and India, the two largest populations in the world.
Right. In fact, the Indian media is reporting the PLA Western Theatre Command as saying that India illegally crossed the line on 31st August at 2 points, the south bank of Pangong Lake and near Rezangla. And the PLA statement also said that India had blatantly provoked and caused tension on the border and had undermined the consensus reached at the diplomatic and military talks. So clearly there is also a statement from the Western Theatre Command. Would you give us a reading of that statement?
Absolutely. I think the Chinese military has already made it very clear that this time it is the Indian side crossing the line of actual control. And it's very detailed as to where and how many soldiers crossed the line of actual control, causing provocations on the Chinese side. And I would say, while the Indian government has released very different stories, if we put things in balance, we should say that on the Chinese side, there is no reason to be agitated about the situation, no reason to cross the line of actual control. Therefore, I think it is time to call on the Indian side to exercise maximum restraint and avoid adding to the confusion on the ground. And if, for example, there is further escalation along the line of actual control between the two countries, The danger is that it may spill out of control and the two sides may come to blow with each other again. And I think this will be very bad for both China and India, and neither China nor India should ever think about more escalation along their line of actual control.
Right. In theory, of course, I agree with you. Cooperation is the way forward. As we discussed on this program earlier also, in fact, with you, there was this sense that China's broader vision of connectivity is something which India should also participate in. But the problem is that while it's not inevitable, despite the two-level talks, the military level and the diplomatic level, as you have also said, the situation remains tense. So the issue of miscalculation or someone going gung-ho about something cannot be ruled out. And then, of course, it can conflagrate.
Absolutely. We can see that since June, since the last time when tension really flared up, resulting in casualties on both sides, China has been very measured and Indian side has been very agitated, including, for example, massive demonstrations inside India and massing up of lots of soldiers along the line of actual control and a lot of activities on the Indian side of the line of actual control. So I would say such extreme activities on the Indian side themselves are not helpful, and hopefully both China and India can de-escalate rather than, for example, move in such a way as to create more mistrust and suspicions, as well as raising more stakes along the line of actual control. I think we need to focus on the mega trend, that is, war between China and India will be very bad for both countries, and both countries really need to exercise maximum restraint and avoid any further escalation. That is the key that both our two countries need to very much focus upon.
It is interesting that you say the Indian side has been very agitated, because that was my sense also. But when I speak with Indian analysts, their point is that, yes, we agitated because we are the aggrieved party, and it's the Chinese who are aggressing. It's the Chinese who do not really want to discuss the line of actual control with India, despite the 93, 96 and further down various dialogue frameworks. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I think we need to look at two incidences. The first one was what happened in the middle of June. And I think even Prime Minister Modi of India mentioned that the incident took place not on the Indian side of the line of actual control. There was no Chinese military incursion into the Indian side of the line of actual control. I think Prime Minister Modi was telling the truth, despite of uproar in India against that. Now, this time, I think the two governments and the two militaries have been talking to each other for months. And China really hopes that both sides will calm down. There will be de-escalation. And I think the indications are very clear that the Indian side moved across the line of actual control, even though the line of actual control itself is not well defined. And sometimes it may blur into a confusing line, and try to really delineate itself may be a task in itself. However, let me emphasize one point. That is, there is no reason and no justification why China want to move across the line of actual control, because China now is 5 times as big as India as an economy. And the Chinese PLA, the military, is very well equipped, much better equipped than the Indian side. And the Chinese army is really on a par with the US military, rather than, for example, comparing itself with the Indian military. So there is no reason why the Chinese side want to be agitated, why China wants to pick a fight against India, because we do believe that both India and China should focus on peace and development, rather than, for example, agitating for a war between the two largest populations in the world.
Correct. I'm very happy you made a point. Thank you so much. That was Professor Victor Gao speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss an interview by the new Foreign Secretary of Sri Lanka, Admiral Professor Jayanath Kolamge, which details that country's foreign policy direction. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about an interview by the new Foreign Secretary of Sri Lanka, Admiral Professor Jayanath Kolamge, which details Sri Lanka's foreign policy choices. Dr. Kolamge says that as far as strategic security is concerned, Sri Lanka will always have an India-first approach. That means Sri Lanka will not do anything harmful to India's strategic security concerns. However, in the same interview, he made clear that Sri Lanka cannot depend on any one country for its economic development. We know China is one country willing to invest and develop. They have the capacity to do it. We have to benefit from it. We have to balance. In essence, Dr. Kolamge has voiced the classic dilemma of a small country that has to deal with two very big countries. Let's discuss with our expert here how Sri Lanka can balance between India and China, especially as relations between India and China deteriorate. And as we discussed last week, US sanctions against CCCC, a Chinese construction company, may force Colombo to reconsider the Chinese company's leading role in the Colombo Port City project. So we are joined by Ross Feingold, an Asia expert, and let's get straight to Mr. Feingold. Mr. Feingold, as I said, this is a classic dilemma of a smaller country. Give us a sense of what the new Foreign Secretary, Professor Kolamge, is trying to say.
Well, he needs to balance the competing concerns. China is obviously a significant investor in Sri Lanka, and at least from the government's perspective, in the past, this investment was welcomed, but over time, there's concerns about the nature of Chinese investment and, of course, the lease that the Chinese have now taken on the port. And there's the concerns from India, obviously, and then the concerns from the United States. So one of the things that's interesting about selecting someone of a naval background is it shows that in some ways Sri Lanka is not looking only at domestic concerns anymore, and domestic politics or past concerns about civil war, terrorism are not necessarily driving its foreign policy, but actually Sri Lanka's role in the region is driving part of its foreign policy as well. And that includes balancing the competing relationships with India and China, but again, also sometimes left out of this conversation, U.S. role as well.
Right. But as far as the Colombo Port City project, and we discussed this last week on this program with a panel of experts, including someone from Sri Lanka, that Colombo was, the India, the US and other countries tried to dissuade Colombo from going ahead with a Chinese company, but they said, well, the Chinese can develop this and we're comfortable with that. Now, of course, the issue is the US sanctions against the CCCC, which is a completely different thing. But Colombo's choice was the Chinese company. But the interesting thing that I find with Admiral's interview is that he says, as far as the strategic security concerns are concerned, it's India first. But when it comes to development, he more or less said, Chinese have the capacity and we are going to balance.
And I think he also noted that India had an opportunity to develop this or other projects in Sri Lanka, but China came with the money and the projects proceeded. One thing to keep in mind when he's making these comments is his background in the military, and specifically the Navy, not coming from the business world and also not coming from the professional foreign service of Sri Lanka, which is also something that's gotten a lot of media attention with this election to be the foreign secretary. It's very tough. Right? He's in a tough spot balancing the Chinese. He doesn't want to alienate them, but he's made it very clear, and obviously his instructions come from the president, that when it comes to the strategic and the security side, they're not looking to do anything that would be inconsistent with India's interests as well. Can he succeed at this very tough task? Only time will tell.
Right. As I said, relations between China and the U.S. are deteriorating. A lot of that has to do with Trump's unilateralism also, but I don't want to jump ahead of the curve, but I believe that there is a bipartisan consensus in Washington with reference to this, although in the event of a new president, which would be the former Vice President Joe Biden, the U.S. would probably rely more on multilateralism rather than Trump's unilateralism, but relations are not going to see an uptick. Similarly, relations between China and India are deteriorating. The fresh tensions in eastern Ladakh. So, in real terms, what kind of space do you see for Sri Lanka to try and balance this?
Well, it's such a great question because when you bring the U.S. into this conversation, and as you noted, people accuse the Trump administration of being too unilateral. The counter to that, at least in this region, would be to say that the U.S. has increased cooperation with Australia, Japan, and India. But one concern from observers, whether it's President Trump's administration or a Biden administration, is providing a sufficient hand of friendship, whether it's investment from American companies, military cooperation, other types of foreign aid, where we worry that the United States is not sufficiently committed to extending that friendship to the smaller countries in the Pacific, countries like the Solomon Islands or Kiribati, for example. And then the same could be said for countries in South Asia, whether it's Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal. Does the U.S. have the desire, the interest, and the resources to really be a good friend to these countries? It's a legitimate question, and if the U.S. is not willing to step up and play that role, then these countries will look to either China or India for the support that they need, whether it's security support or investment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ross Feingold, speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.